So, Annemarie, you were up at Holyrood last week. How was that, and what was it for, and what happens next with that experience?
Well, we were there to launch the Right to Recovery Bill, which was a bill written by me and a guy called Stevie Wishart, and we get help obviously from some lawyers who were very sympathetic, who had seen lots of people come forward to get help for addiction and not be able to access it. So we've tried in many ways to change the addiction treatment system, and because Stevie and these lawyers had experience of homelessness and how the homeless system in Scotland has changed, we put our minds together and came up with this bill. So we were launching the bill. Obviously, it was Douglas Ross that is launching it as a members' bill for the Tory party. And we were there just presenting it basically to the Parliament. It'll now go to a health committee, and there'll be the first stage. So with any bill, there's three stages. The first stage, in each stage it has to get enough votes in order to progress into the next stage. So we'll start to see the parliamentarians talk about it. There'll probably be stuff in the press about it. But what I really need people today, ordinary working class people, is to vote for it, to tell their MSPs to vote for it. So I need them to write to their MSPs and to ask their MSPs to support the Right to Recovery Bill.
So, the bill, first thing is, what does it change, and why do we need it?
Right, well, currently, if you approach addiction services and you ask for, a lot of services like detox, for instance, or community rehab or residential rehab, and other stuff as well, like various other harm reduction interventions, it can be really, really hard to get access to them, and it's impossible to get a choice. Currently in this country, it's the rich that get rehab, the poor get methadone, and if it's booze, it's really hard to get anything other than anti-abuse, which is a medicine that makes you sick if you drink on top of it. So it's really hard to get services that can help you get freedom from dependency. So like medical detox services, community rehab, residential rehab, as I said. Trauma services. A lot of people who end up in addiction have, they've got, a lot of trauma that's usually what leads to addiction in the first place. So services that can help us get freedom from dependency are really, really limited in Scotland. So this bill would change that. It would give people the opportunity to challenge whoever's making the decision. So currently at the moment, as everybody knows on the ground, that if you're asking for help, it's really, really difficult to get it. Like we've got people who have been on, substitute prescriptions for 20 and 30 years, and we're not saying that, substitute prescriptions are bad. We're saying like they're absolutely got a part to play. Like there's a continuum of care here, but the majority of the investment in your addiction treatment services currently goes into what the industry calls harm reduction interventions. They also call those interventions treatment, but when the public thinks about treatment, they think about rehab, quite rightly. So there's this difference with the language, like what the public understands and what the industry says. So currently, if the industry tells you that you're not ready for detox or you're not ready for rehab, you've got to go with that decision. And what this bill would do would be allow you to challenge that decision, to say, well, actually, I do think I'm ready and I would really like to change that. We all know people that have been on methadone for 20, 30 years. We all know people who have got alcohol addiction who have never been able to access rehab. Or to even to access a detox service, which is the very basic, like I'd spin dry, like I'd get dried out, because alcohol will kill you if you try and withdraw from it on your own. There's no more dangerous drug as far as a withdrawal is concerned. Like alcohol is the most dangerous drug to withdraw from. So, we want to help people get freedom from dependency. We want to empower them to be able to do that and take the power away to a certain extent from the current decision makers. We're big believers in personal responsibility. We know that when we reach out for help, we actually want help to get freedom, to get unaddicted, and currently our services are not helping us do that.
So, in layman's terms, right, I follow most of that. Just some words because you're a specialist in this, and you believe you run a charity as well that helps people with addiction issues. So, is it basically fair to say that currently the vast majority of people with addictions, when they get help, there's some tablets and medicine.
I think that's completely fair to say.
And the minority is actually help, as in psychological help and rehab and putting people through. And is that what you're trying to turn around, or at least give people the option of?
Aye, so we're trying to balance the investment. So 95% or more actually of the investment is going into those harm reduction interventions.
Which is like giving somebody methadone, is that?
Aye, and it, that tries to help people use drugs or alcohol in a safer way. What we're arguing for is not to stop doing that. We don't want to stop doing that. We don't want money taken away from those interventions. But what we're arguing for is a balance. So we're also saying that, we want the same investment getting put into services that help people get freedom from dependency. And, we want that hope that people can actually recover to be part of the system again. It used to be, it is part of the system in England. So, we want people to be able to access services.
So is what you're asking for in this bill basically to bring us in line with the rest of the United Kingdom? Is that where it would end up?
Well, it would actually make us better than the rest of the United Kingdom, and the rest of the world, in fact. It's world leading. So if we pass this bill, we've had a lot of patter in the Scottish Parliament about world leading bills, but this actually is a world leading bill.
What would make it world leading, and by default as well, would also make it different for the rest of the United Kingdom? So what are these things that you're trying to achieve that are so big?
It would give people the legal right. So currently the easiest way to describe it is, at the moment you've got a legal right to a house over your head. Okay. Right, to a roof over your head. And it would give people the legal right to access treatment, because at the end of the day, the politicians decide whether or no funding goes into these areas, right? And at the whim of any of these politicians, they could take funding away from treatment, as they have done in Scotland many, many times. Hence why one of the reasons why we've seen so many deaths, just one of the reasons. But it would make it the law that politicians couldn't do that anymore, the same way that they've made it law in homelessness and in housing.
Okay, so what happens just now then is, if I had an addiction, I was to go for help, they were able to say, well, that's what we're doing for you, and that would be it. It either works for me or it doesn't. So it basically gives me a bit of power. And then what happens then, if there's an imbalance between where the investment's going, it's just into the Scottish government to sort out that investment. And if 95% is going on giving folk methadone or keeping them on alcohol, whatever it is, and trying to manage the situation, then it's just down to them. The responsibility is down to them to actually find the funding. Would that be fair to say?
That's fair. I think what it does is it empowers the individual to be responsible for their own health. So currently at the moment, there's too many barriers for the individual to get access to the type of services that they're asking for. So for instance, the rich get rehab and the poor get methadone, and if it's alcohol, you get anti-abuse. So this would empower the individual to take responsibility for their addiction, and it would help them access the services that can actually get them well.
Yeah, we were talking before we hit the record button, and you'd mentioned the anti-abuse before. That's a drug basically that if you're an alcoholic, you have an addiction with the alcohol, you take the tablet and any alcohol goes in your system, you just feel physically sick. So then in turn, you would drink less or zero. Is that basically?
That's the theory, aye. That's the thinking behind it. But the mental obsession for alcohol often overrides, the fear of being sick. And of course, people can then stop taking anti-abuse as well. So what we need to tackle here is, why are people, willing to self-harm? Why are people willing to hurt themselves in order to get that mental relief? And I think that's a much bigger question. We could have a whole podcast on that alone.
Well, your tea was all right, so we may do one next week. So, right, aye, and this is something that's not been done anywhere else in the world, that actually the addict has a decision and has a bit of power.
Aye, there's no legal right in any other part of the world, so so it would be world leading. And it wouldn't just be, when we talk about people, there's no other part of the world either that is so treats people the way that we treat them. No, that's probably not true, actually. There's probably places that treat addicts a lot worse than how we treat them. But in the Western world, there's usually some sort of choice available, you know, or you can challenge a decision in some way. And currently in the UK and many parts of Europe and the Western world, you can't do that. But also in other parts of the world, you do have access and choice, so you don't need to challenge the decision because you're getting access and choice to other services other than just the substitute medication or the medically assisted recovery, as they call it now in Scotland.
So there are places in the world are offering this, they just don't need it in their legislation because they're already offering it, whereas you feel we're probably needing to sort of stranglehold the government here into saying to these people options.
Well, it's because it's not just a stranglehold. We've tried every other way. Do you know what I mean? The stranglehold is actually coming from the way the structures are set up at the moment. So our current system comes through our public health system, right? So it comes through our public services like the council and the NHS. Now, in other parts of the world, even in England, the majority of the treatment comes through the third sector. So the charitable sector is mainly in charge of this area. Now, what the public sector does is it puts forward really compassionate, kind, highly professional social workers and nurses who are great people, and you know they've got lots of qualifications, but they don't know how to get addicts and alcoholics out the hole that they're in. Whereas in England, for instance, because the majority of the money comes through the third sector, over 50% of the workforce are people in recovery. And what that does is that changes the culture of addiction. So it means that when I walk into a service in England, I'm probably going to be met by somebody who's in recovery who knows how to get me out the hole I'm in. And that's not the case in Scotland. And what this bill would do would be it would mean that the funding structures are fundamentally changed from the bottom up. So it would take the power away from those health and social care partnerships, which currently divvy up the money through the NHS and through the council, and it would put the choice and access into the person's hands. You know, it wouldn't necessarily mean that, you know, they walk in and say, right, I want rehab, and you get rehab. That's not what happens. If you're unhappy with a decision that's been made by the current addiction services, you have an opportunity to challenge it. So it's gaining a level of accountability that just isn't there, because at the moment, if you're told you're getting anti-abuse or you're getting methadone, it's like, well, there's no way to challenge it. And even if you do make complaints, the complaints, you know, they're marking their own daughters. It's getting heard by the people who are making the decision. And what this would do would be empower people to challenge those decisions.
Yeah. So, see, to get to this stage, how long has it took to get to just this stage one, as it were?
Yeah, it's 2021, Stevie and I started this process.
That doesn't sound that. I was expecting a longer.
Well, 2020, when we first wrote the bill and started floating the idea and asking people about it and getting legal advice, 2021, the Tories first tabled it, started to, you know, float the idea. We went to a consultation, with a public consultation. Over 80% of the public supported it. Every church in Scotland supported it. All the poverty charities supported it. All the homeless charities supported it. A lot of Civic Scotland supported it in the consultation stage. So the addiction sector, I think there was 7 charities in the addiction sector, mainly small charities, supported it, but the big quangos, the big government funded charities, have more or less kept stum.
Aye, that's like turkeys voting for Christmas though, isn't it? So it's not just a case of you go and have a meeting with Douglas Ross and say, Douglas, this is a thing that I think makes sense, and Douglas Ross looks at it and goes, that's so I'll motion that in Parliament. That's no the process. You need to go through all these hoops to get to just here. So the first thing is it goes to a committee. Then they'll take in some outside information and advice, I take it. What's stage 2? Is that then putting it in the floor of Parliament for a vote?
I think there's a vote that happens at stage 1 as well in order to get to stage 2. Then in stage 2 there's an evidence, they gather evidence, so the calls for evidence go out. I have concerns about that process because currently the addiction sector is very dominated by government funded quangos. So I think, you know, like we saw with the GRR bill, a lot of government quangos sort of were called to give evidence, and those who had issues with that bill weren't called or didn't get a chance to say anything. And I think the opposite of that might happen this time, that people that want this bill to succeed might not get called. So I'm cautious of the actual the process itself, just because Scotland's politics are so in such a mess at the moment.
I'm not a fan of them. My own, it's not my podcast, this is yours, so I don't want to take too much time talking about it, but I don't like the political system just now. I don't like the party politics side of it, and I think it needs restructuring, to be perfectly honest with you. I think we need more Bob for Bathgate that's a builder up there, talking common sense and logic, rather than, I find it difficult to, let's take SNP for example. I think you've got 60 odd MSPs, and they all wear a yellow rosette, and we're expecting them all to have the same view. And now you see wee clinks like Ewan says, no, I don't agree with that. Well, you get suspended from Parliament for a few days because you don't agree. And I think it's ridiculous that we expect everybody with a red rosette and a blue rosette and a yellow rosette to have the exact same opinions on everything. And I would prefer a more open form of government.
Yeah, I think so. I think I think the days of that have to come to an end. People have to be allowed to vote with their conscience. I think what's interesting about this bill is that the politicians claim that it has cross-party support, but we'll actually see, when it comes to the crunch, when we have first approached the different political parties about adopting this, they hummed and hawed because they saw how difficult it was and how big a deal it was as well. And it was the Tories that took us up on it, and we were very sceptical about that because they're so used to playing political football with this issue. And what reassured myself and Stevie, certainly me, was that 4 or 5 different Tory MSPs spoke to us at length and at depth about people they had lost because they didn't have access and choice of services. And those Tory tears were what convinced me, because they did have tears in their eyes. They told me their personal stories, and that convinced me that it wasn't a politically motivated.
Yeah, and then that's another thing that you've got to be wary in this day and age, is somebody's reaction politically motivated or not, but you feel you're confident. I mean, I don't want to talk about your politics and your own philosophies in politics, but I think I'm going to hazard a guess here and say you're not a Tory member. No. Right? So you've sat there with these people that you're maybe sceptical about and feeling that they can, and you've seen raw emotion in them.
Craig, I was completely direct with every single Tory member that I speak to, and I told them up front in the beginning, I don't believe you. I think you're using this as a political football. And they said, well, Annemarie, here's why I think it's important to take this forward. And every one of them told me a story about somebody they'd lost, and I watched them weep.
I mean, that is refreshing, to be honest with you, because a lot of people say to me, because of a lot of the podcasts I do, you just take the SNP. Well, I don't, they just happen to be in power now, and I do disagree with a lot of things that they've done. But if it was Tories, or if it was Labour, or if it was Liberal Democrats, and they were doing things wrong, they just happen to be the ones in power now. So that's refreshing, and that gives me a wee bit more.
I think what's also interesting about this bill is, it cuts across all the unionists, all the nationalists, all the separatists, all the politics, the sectarian stuff. We've got a lot of support from, the unionists, and from, I don't even know, I'm personally, we spoke about this earlier, I'm personally Catholic, and that's the reason why we've got that cross section of support, is because this cuts across all our communities. Everybody's dying.
Addiction isn't sectarian, Annemarie. Do you know what I mean?
Or political.
Aye, it will get a hold of anybody. Now, wish you all the best with this, obviously. I mean, I don't think a lot of people, when they're activists and they're campaigning, it's a very personal thing. I'm not suggesting this isn't personal to you, but it's quite a narrow field. But what you're discussing, and we spoke about it as I was setting up the cameras, I've lost 3 friends to addictions, and I know people currently that have got addiction problems. I've got a lot of friends that are, I don't know if you could, the terminology is a recovered addict. I don't know if that's a term that you can actually use or no, but guys that have had issues dealing with them, and being dry or being sober or being whatever for a long, long time in their life, but still see themselves as addicts. So I know a lot of people, and I think what you're trying to achieve is the opposite of most people's drivers, which are quite narrow. This is widespread, and if you went and sat in a room with Labour MPs or NSP MPs or Alba or Lib Dem, this touches so much of society that it doesn't. I don't think the colour of your rosette matters here.
No, you're bang on the money, you know, and just as addiction's totally contagious, so is recovery, you know, and if we were to get recovery into our communities, we saw addiction ravage our communities in the 80s and 90s, it's still ravishing our poorest communities, it's our poorest communities that are dying, and the reason why the politicians can get away with playing political football here is because those communities don't vote. So that's why I need the punters that watch this to go and write to their MSPs. Just go into a site called Write to Them, it'll, you know, and say, I want you to support the Right to Recovery Bill. Or you can go into our website and, you know, get more information about it as well. But we need the ordinary punters to step up here and to force them into the politicians, because the people that are dying don't vote. So we're no constituency or consequence to the politicians. So they can get away with just, you know, playing political football with this issue, but they will only get away with it if the ordinary punters in Scotland step up and tell them to vote for it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I take it, I'll get links and that off you and we can put them on the podcast and the description and stuff. So when does this happen? What's that time scale we got to get to the next hurdle?
Right, so I think this week it should go, we should hear announcements about a health committee, and somewhere between now and Christmas it'll go through the first stage. I can't see it you know, getting through before the summer, so I think between now and Christmas we need everybody to write to their MSPs to support this. Okay. That'll be the first stage. Yeah,
and the more people that tell them, regardless of their own, listen, this is the sort of thing that might no need anybody conscience, because they might have enough themselves, but it'll never be a bad thing, give them a nudge towards it. And the more nudges they get towards it, the more likely they have a saying, go for that. And the only thing I've got a small concern about is the way, and I've just spoke about it, the way politics works, and I've got a blue rosette and you've got a red one. Are there people who their default setting will be, I'm going to vote against this because it's the Tories that's putting it forward?
I think so. And I think that when that happens, if that happens, shame on them. That is because, you know, we've got the highest drug deaths, we've got the highest alcohol deaths in Europe. You know, this isn't about politics, this is about people's lives. And if they do that, the Scottish people won't forget.
No, I've got a saying, and a lot of people pull me up any time I say it, but I've got great faith in the Scottish electorate, that we get it right more often than we get it wrong, and we judge people and we vote accordingly. And if MSPs just get that in their head, then I'm sure they'll pass it. Now, you involve a charity. Did you form the charity? Is that?
I did. Me and 11 other people. We set it up in 2013. We started doing the work in 2009, but we originally set up as a community group and then a community interest company. But we became an official charity in 2013.
And what does the charity do?
So we do three things primarily. We make recovery visible, first and foremost. I'm a person in long-term recovery. We advocate for access and choice of services, and this has took us to the bill. And thirdly, we campaign to educate people about addiction and what it is, you know, like how you can recover from it primarily. So we fight for people as well. We've got 1.5 staff currently in Scotland, well, 2.5 including me. We're a wee tiny outfit. We've got about 100 volunteers that help us throughout the year. But those 1.5 staff will help if you've got a family member who is trying to get access to treatment. Our staff will fight for them to get that access.
I feel sorry for this half a person you've got. Are they 3 fit or part-time?
Davy. Well, Davy's paid half a wage, but he works 1.5 times the hours he's probably paid for. So, aye.
So what's the name of the charity, Annemarie?
Called Faces and Voices of Recovery.
Is that Glasgow based?
We're Glasgow based, but we're UK wide. We've got 6,500 members across the UK. So.
And what sort of practical help do you give addicts and help them in their path to recovery?
Well, we usually fight for them to get access to rehab or to get access to so for instance, we have got people who don't want methadone anymore, but they would like to try another drug, which is less, you know, it's not as sedative like. a drug called Buvidal, which, still takes away the cravings and hods them better. So we'll advocate for, people who are trying to get detox, trying to get rehab, who have got problems with their housing, who are having difficulties with anything basically, but mainly we advocate for people to get access and choice of treatment.
And how do you get to these people? Do they come to you? Do you just go and grab them?
Oh no, we don't need to advertise. We've got waiting lists as long as,
Seriously, for your services? And how are you funded?
We get, for that advocacy project, the 1.5 staff, we get 50 grand a year from the Cora Foundation, purely for that.
How do I know that name?
The Cora Foundation are arm's length Scottish Government organisation.
CORA?
CORRA. So our turnover last year was about 140 grand, a bit more than that. 50 grand was purely for that advocacy service. The rest of the money I raise through sponsorship, big borrowing, I don't steal. But we raise it through sponsorship, and that basically pays for my wage and all the other campaigning work that we do. So
brilliant. And you said something there, and again it's terminology and you use my English. Did you say an active recovery when you were describing yourself?
Aye, so I'm a person of long-term recovery.
Long-term recovery. Aye. What does that mean?
Well, for me it means I've not used alcohol or any other drugs for nearly 27 years.
Super duper. You must have some amount of badges and key rings in.
Aye, I do actually. I've got a pink key ring. My last key ring was a 25-year key ring. Aye, so that it means, like, I believe as well, like, living clean and sober is truly radical and revolutionary. I really do, you know what I mean? Like, people talk about being rebels, and I'm like, well, actually, living clean and sober is pretty rebellious in today's society, and it's radical as well, and it's, believe me, it's revolutionary.
And what do you think the biggest reason? I mean, I think it's fair to say if we've got rising drug deaths, is it fair to say then we've got rising amount of users?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Why is that? Why is society that is progressing
Mm-hmm.
in loads of other fields creating more addicts? What's wrong with?
Well, you're asking me the big questions now. Like, I think there's a lot of distractions, isn't there? So, from my point of view, I can see how different it is from when I was growing up. Even though I got addicted really young, I can see now how there's so many distractions now, and that is essentially what addiction is. Addiction isolates us, it takes us away. Now, that addiction can be, obviously in my case it was alcohol and other drugs, but it can be porn, it can be online stuff, it can be gaming, it can be sex, it can be shopping, it can just be this, it can just not be living here in the present, talking to each other. So
what you're suggesting then, there's things in society, let's say it was gaming, I think that's a cracking example, because I've seen people addicted to that. So when you get that, you then, if you want to come away from that, you need to fill up your other addictions. Is that what you're saying then? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, in a lot of cases, in my experience, and many people that I know's experience, like, you let go, it's like playing a game of whack-a-mole. You let go of one substance or behaviour and another one might pop up. But I think the society that we live in promotes that as well. Like, we're constantly being forced down these routes to, whether it be, the next big telly or the, like materialism, the things that society values around materialism is being pushed on us all the time, whether it be an instant gratification that we can get access to, whether it be Netflix binging or, sex or OnlyFans or pornography, whatever it is, we've got instant gratification at our fingertips all the time. So that instant gratification just sets up a obsession and compulsion, and we can easily move between addictions.
Because alcohol's been here for a long time, drugs have been here for a long time. But there must be more people. So is society creating the addict, forgetting about what they're addicted to at this point? So you believe then that society is creating addicts of anything, and they will eventually, some of them will fall into drugs, some will fall into alcohol, some will fall into computer games?
I think it's never been easier for us to fall into addiction, I think, or to be nudged or pushed into addiction. I think societal values have shifted and changed so much in the last 50 years, you know, like, we've normalised addiction in a way that isn't really questionable anymore. So if you think about Scotland, we're the biggest users of cocaine in the world.
Serious? In the world?
In the world.
Oh.
In the world. But you
can tell I'm not getting out as much as I used to.
well, you go into any pub or, you know, even a venue, like I was coming back from Medjugorje a couple of months ago and the plane, and there was a couple in their 60s telling me they were at a funeral and everybody was taking cocaine at this funeral. They couldn't believe it. And I was like, well, it's pretty normal, you know, like I don't, you know, the football, like Scotland, as I said, we're the highest users of cocaine in the world. It's completely normalised now. We normalised oblivion a long time ago. Do you know what I mean? So how we get our oblivion, like I know when I cleaned up, when I got sober, I was living in London, and I was really shocked that people weren't, and you know, when I started going out again to pubs and clubs and stuff, I was really shocked that everybody was miraculous. But I think that was very much not that English people don't get miraculous, but it was very much normalised and accepted here that oblivion was, you know, that was why most people drank, was to get out their nut. You know, that was very much part of our culture. And I think that's still the same, you know, that normalisation of addiction, that it's acceptable.
Yeah, so do you think we're just further ahead of the game then because of the culture in Scotland? When you and I were kids, I think we're roughly about the same age, so, you know, brought up 70s, 80s and parties with the cans of tenants export all the house and stuff.
I think, you know, the analogy, you will if your family were miners, like the canary in the mine, right? So I think the Scots, maybe the Irish as well, are the canary in the mine. So I think what we're highlighting here is that there's something about the way our society and there's a malady, there's a spiritual malady, I believe, right? And people are trying to fix that in a variety of different ways, whether it's fixing it through substance addiction or behavioural addiction or consume, just consume, fix. So I think that's coming to a crescendo now, and people are starting to question that. I know certainly my son's generation are starting to question it. They're starting to say, well, I don't really want that. I want, I was without sounding, I think they're sort of trying to return, my son's generation are interested in returning to traditional values, that maybe our generation knocked hell out of, do you know what I mean? So, I don't know, I think there's a malaise, and I think there's a question around maybe the God question, like we've got a hole in our soul that we're trying to fix and we're trying to fill. And I think maybe that is some sort of God now. And I know the word God assaults a lot of people and they instantly think religion. And of course they're going to think that because I'm Catholic as well. But I'm talking about a bigger thing than religion. I'm talking about a hole in our spirits, something that's needing fixed, that's needing filled, that's needing sorted, and people are trying to do that in ways that are harmful to themselves.
So see the reasons that we have got the worst drug deaths in Europe then, that blows my head about cocaine and the world, because the world's a big place, right? So do you think it's society driven and the politicians have just not been ahead of the game to try and sort it and help it? Is this needing loads of people to sort it out, the politicians with support, etc., and society in general to say screwing it up, we don't need oblivion anymore?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. So I think the politicians have become very focused on, like you said, the party politics rather than serving the people. They've become very focused on, we just need to look at our political system and the people that have come up through the ranks, that many of them served as researchers or assistants to old MPs, whereas when we were growing up, MSPs or MPs would have been people that had been titans of industry, or they'd been long-term retired social workers. These were people that had careers, that had lived in the real world, that had served in the real world in some way and were sort of called into politics to try and make things better. Whereas what we've got now is a generation of politicians who are career politicians. They've came in So I think that's a big part of the problem.
The other problem we've got is, and I'm not saying it's a problem because I don't like the place, I like to deal in common sense and logic. And 25 years ago, as an area of the United Kingdom, Scotland, we had to find 40 to 50 MPs to go and fight our corner in Westminster. Then, 25 years ago, we had a Scottish Parliament and we had to find another 130. So not only, which you're suggesting, the generational difference with it's career politicians and all that, people with no life experiences, we're having to find three times the amount. So I think, again, just applying common sense and logic, that if you go back 30, 40 years, the skill pool to pick from to look for that amount was going to get a fair idea that they're going to be all right. But now we're looking for 3 times the size of that. What makes us think, and now we're filling it with people that have not got the life skills and the old and I can think back, my teenage years, my early 20s, where there was politicians right across the board that, whether you agreed with them or no, you actually had respect for them because they were politicians. And now, especially Westminster, probably even more so actually, but there's a guy, the Anderson boy down, I've only come across him in the last 6 months now. I'm not saying his politics are right or wrong, by the way, but what I'm saying is, can you imagine a Westminster full of Lee Andersons? People that have been through and like the type of guys that you're describing for earlier generations. So maybe that's got something to do with it. That, there is a different, it's now an occupation.
Aye. So it's a career choice rather than a calling. I think if you're called to politics in some way now, you would be very put off stepping up because it's so, people are not respected. And to be fair, I don't think we should have a lot of respect for our current politicians. And like you said, if they're not serving the people, if they think they're there to have power over the people, which certainly is how our Scottish Parliament is operating and has been, for quite considerable time now, there seems to be a misunderstanding of what they're there to do. They're there to serve us, and I think they've forgot that.
Well, I've been saying a lot of things about this, and it was something that was in. I was invited to talk at a hate speech rally outside Parliament on the 1st of April, the day the hate bill came out, and it was something I said that day that I've sort of honed in on. They need reminded that they're our servants, right? That's what they are. We're not their subservients, and the whole thing seems to run its. And I watch sometimes, like First Minister's questions, and I watch the way they even talk to each other. And one of the, I'm no great fan of Humza Yousaf. I think that's apparently anybody that's seen more than 2 of my videos. But he was talking one day, and the guy for the Liberal Democrats asked him a question, and he basically said to him, "Who do you think you're talking to? You've got 4 MSPs in here." And I thought, well, what if I decided to be an MSP and I was sitting there alone as an independent? Does that mean I don't deserve a voice? Yeah. And he actually, and I thought, and then I started looking at them all, and by the way, they're all guilty of it, just different degrees. And then Swinney comes along, and Swinney says, we're going to have a new different type of parliament, and within 32 seconds he started contradicting what he said. He was making a speech about how, we should be better behaved in here, more respectful, and then he said to the presiding officer, saying, I probably know what we make, because remember what I used to be like when I was in the back benches? Yeah. Mate, you're trying to convince us of this new era, and during your speech, you're telling us you'll probably break it.
And I think there's a lot of that. I think there's a lot of virtue signalling language. I think there's a lot of rhetoric that says the right thing, but actually actions speak louder than words. I was asked by a journalist the other day, how are you going to convince Annemarie, the parliamentarians, to vote for this bill? And I said, what do you mean? I said, I don't have to convince the parliamentarians to vote for this bill. They have to convince the people of Scotland why they're no voting for it.
Well, that's right. If they vote against it, now this is the thing I don't like. See, this abstaining carry on, it does man in sometimes when it's something. See, if it was something like, should we have Trident, should we not have Trident, I go, well, that's a pretty hot potato. But see this, where it's something that's so almost personalised, it affects people at the rawest level. Anybody that abstains for that vote when it comes to a vote needs a slap in the head. And you need to have a look at their job description, right? It's not a complex thing here. There's complex things in it. The actual overriding thing isn't that difficult to get your head around.
Yeah.
I mean, I've managed to do it in 10.5 minutes.
Yeah.
That, you know, that. So I think you're right. If they want to vote against it, then they've got to question. That's where the question.
They're answerable to us. They've got to convince me and persuade me why they're voting against it. I mean, like you mentioned the hate crime bill, and I was there, April.
Oh yeah,
as well. Yeah, I heard your speech.
was all right.
I was there. I was standing behind the stage.
You give me any grief? There was somebody booed for behind me, Annemarie. I need to get my jacket.
I know. No, but you know that what I found abhorrent about that bill was, you know, the hate crime monster was they actually highlighted in the bump or the rhetoric around the hate crime bill, it was likely to be young white men under 30 from socially economically deprived communities who were most likely to be hateful. I thought that was the most racist, bigoted, hateful thing I'd ever seen come out of any public institution in Scotland. And our young white men from backgrounds have got enough to overcome without being pigeonholed as hateful, racist bigots, when actually it was an inversion. It was actually the people who are putting that forward. And this is what I hate about our parliament. The people who are putting these ideas forward are actually the people who are hateful, racist bigots.
Wow, calm down. You sound like me.
I know. Well, it's true. Yeah. It's like, but it's like they're gaslighting us. They're turning it all around. You know what I mean? It's really sick.
Nah, I think the whole thing needs resolved. We can't go on like this. I think, and again, we're starting to gaff in one here, right? But I think what's happened to our country in the last, since 2014, the referendum was so divisive, right? And I can remember before that, you would go and vote at your elections, and you might go home and your partner or your pals or somebody at your workmate say, "How did you vote for?" It was nothing more than a throwaway comment. And so your relationship was personal between you and that polling booth. But in the run up to the referendum, regardless of what way you were wanting to vote, everybody demanded that you tell them. And we've not really got away from that. So now, 10 years later, we're at this where everybody demands to know everything about your politics, right? And I find that pretty weird for where I was before, that you didn't know. And I think it's led to a very divisive society we live in now. That used to just be Rangers and Celtic we fell out with now. Now it's, do you vote SNP, do you not vote them, do you want independence, do you not want independence, do you like Humza Yousaf, do you not like Humza Yousaf? And you're like, the social media's probably played a big part in that as well. And everybody has to know right now. How do you feel about this?
And you're not allowed to change your mind either. Do you know what I mean?
Aye,
so
that's a fair
like
point.
with any issue, like if you do, like for instance, when we advocated for a long time for drug consumption rooms, because the evidence base looked like that was a good idea.
That was something I was wanting to come on to, actually. I'm glad you brought it up.
So with drug consumption rooms, when they're done well, and I've visited them, you know, they're horrendous places. I don't care what anybody says, you know, it's like it's utter degradation. They're supposed to be offering dignity, but watching people harm themselves is, you know, completely without dignity. But what gave me solace in those places was that if you wanted to access rehab, you could within literally that day. So I was reassured when I went to Copenhagen to H17 that somebody who was seeking help could access help, could get into a facility that they could actually, you know, get freedom from dependency in. In that context, I would definitely argue for drug consumption rooms. But that's not the context we live in Scotland. So we're opening one of them, and we've not got any rehab to send people to, or we've got really limited numbers of rehab. So then people are like, she was on the radio saying that, you know, we need drug consumption rooms. Aye, in the context of a continuum of care. But if you're only helping people to use drugs safer, you know, and that in itself is a misnomer, because using drugs isn't safe, full stop. If you're only doing that and you're not doing the other end of the wedge, which is actually helping people get clean and sober, or even helping them, you know, with other stuff along the way, like wound care, etc., and those services are really difficult to access as well in Scotland. That's ethically unsound for a start. Do you know what I mean? If you're only doing that, if you're only doing one end of it. So when people say, she was supporting drug consumption rooms and now she's no. And I'm just like, no, there's nuance here.
So where are we with this? Are we getting them or not?
We're getting them, they're opening up. There's one supposedly opening up in Hunter Street, just at the Barras.
But it'll basically be a building or a room somewhere in there. There's a clean door.
Support a cabin.
Away you go.
Support a cabin. Support a cabin, and there will be no access to rehab for it.
So what's the benefit? What is the project? What are these people projecting as a benefit to that then?
Well, they always project and they say that it can help people access treatment. But if there's no treatment there, it's rhetoric, it's virtue signalling, it's lies, you know.
So what's happening in Copenhagen is a good thing, but you bring that here and you don't do the same as the Copenhagen model.
It's the same with decriminalisation, right? So decriminalisation says that we shouldn't criminalise people that are sick with addiction. Of course, everybody would agree with that. But in order for decriminalisation to work, you need other stuff in place. So you need dissuasion, so you need the police and the element that the police have, right? You need prevention in your schools, you need harm reduction, the interventions that we spoke about, you need treatment, and you need, there's 5 pillars to how the Portuguese model worked. By the way, Portugal isn't working anymore because they've took funding away from the other pillars, right? In Scotland, we've only got 1 pillar, which is harm reduction. We don't have all the other stuff in place to make decriminalisation a valuable thing. But of course, up front, you go, of course you shouldn't be criminalise people that are sick. It makes sense. But then you've got to have the infrastructure to support all that. Otherwise, you're just co-signing. And, like the police will tell you, like they would love to be able to signpost somebody to a service, that can actually help them get well. But the police know as well. And actually the unintended consequences of decriminalisation, and this is the situation we're in the news. But if I score, right, and I get lifted by the police catch me, I get bung in the cells, and I get, I'm sick, I'm starting to rattle, right? And then a doctor will come along and I'll get methadone or something. See, now, that's not happening. What's happening now is I've just scored, police come along, might get caught, they'll take my drugs off me and, punt me on my way. But I'm still sick. I've not used my drugs yet. So I'm even more desperate than what I was an hour ago. Do you know what I mean? So that's the unintended consequences here of decriminalisation. If you take my drugs off me, I'm even more desperate than what I was. I'm going to do what I need to do, but now I'm even sicker. Do you know what I mean? Whereas the old system, you would maybe get thrown in the cells, but you would get access to, methadone or something else. So there's a lot of more nuance to this than what people just see.
I'm conscious of the time we've got left, and I just want to touch on your own personal experience, if that's all right. You were in a situation that we don't need to get into right now, right? That sounded like we'll be doing it later, right? That way, I'm not saying it's not important, but the important thing, a question I've got is, something happened in your life to go from that person that was dependent on whatever you're dependent to become a person who wanted not to be dependent on anything anymore. What was the trigger?
The thing that made the difference to me was meeting other people in recovery. So they told me that basically, for me, alcohol and other drugs were the solution. And they told me about another solution. And they were like, well, we've got this other solution. You might give it a try. And I didn't really believe them, but I've not used any alcohol or other drugs since. Wow. So it worked.
And how does somebody who is dependent on drugs and alcohol get into the company with these people who are recovering? How did that come about? Because I'd imagine there were 2 different societies.
Aye, completely. Well, really daft story. My pal was a hairdresser and I'd never been to the hairdressers before. And she went to Australia and I had to go to the hairdressers, and the guy in the hairdressers was somebody that was clean and sober. And at the time my mother was really suffering, and I was telling him all about my mother's alcoholism, and he suggested that I should go to Al-Anon, which is a fellowship, a 12-step fellowship for family and friends of people who have got, alcohol problems. And a couple of days later, I get a phone call from my sister saying my ma had ended up in hospital again, and I phoned this guy, this hairdresser, and I said, you need to take me to one of the Al-Anon meetings. I need to find out how to get my ma sober. And he said, well, I can't the night, but you're welcome to come to, I'm going to my AA home group, Alcoholics Anonymous. He says, you can come there and find out, there'll be stuff there that you'll find out. And I went to that meeting that night and I've never used anything since.
Wow. So you went about it in a roundabout way, whereas the driver for you was to try and help your mother. But you then saw the process in front of you and thought, I could do a bit of this in my life.
Well, aye, because what I heard at that meeting was people talking about how I thought and how I felt. And I had never considered that I personally was an addict. But what I heard at that meeting blew my mind wide open. And I was like, yeah.
That's incredible.
And I could see I come from a big Irish Catholic family. So I've got aunties who's one that's a couple of years older than me and then one that's 5 years older than me. You know, so I could see the progression of the illness throughout my family. My ma's the oldest sister, so I could see the road ahead of me. So I was very, very lucky. I was very, very blessed. I didn't, you know, one of the main barriers to treatment for people is that people who are addicted don't think they're that bad. And I always thought, oh, I'm still going to my work. Do you know what I mean? If I ever stopped going to my work, well, then I would maybe chuck it. Or if I ever did this, you know, I moved the goalpost. I was only 25 when I got clean, but I kept moving the goalpost. You know, if I ever done that, or if I ever done that, well, then I would maybe tackle it. And of course, because I had a family who were, you know, there was a lot of alcoholics in the family as well and addicts, I could see, you know, like it was kind of normalised as well, you know. So we were all functioning, we all had jobs, we all had, you know, all this stuff. Because you always think the alcoholic or the addicts, the wee guys skirting about looking for a tenner bag, or the old guy in the park, you know. So these people at this first meeting really blew my mind. Yeah.
I mean, my past, a lot of my working life was sales manager in different industries, and the longest time was the motor trade. And I couldn't figure it out for a while. But I had so many addicts working below me in certain different places that I couldn't. And then the penny dropped. I thought the type of job we give you, it's no, you come in here 95, you do that, and we give you X amount of pounds every week, you've got the same amount of money. You can come in on Saturday and make that amount of money, and the next Saturday make even more if you want. So it seemed to attract people who had to get money. And that's probably why I've come in contact with so many people with issues, because that industry, if you are functioning and able to have a job, it probably made more sense of getting into that than other jobs, because they just go, well, and then, you know, if you don't make any money Monday or Tuesday, it's not the worst thing in the world. And then, and I've seen horrible things. I've seen guys who didn't work for the sale, they worked for the deposit, because then they'd get a cash deposit off a customer. They wouldn't steal it, they would just take a line of it. And they would, where did they go? And they were away doing something with that to get that, whatever it is their thing was. And I've come in, I maybe had a disproportionate amount of contact with people with addictions.
Maybe no.
No, did if I worked in an office?
No, maybe no. I think we've got a stereotypical view of what an addict or an alcoholic looks like, and it's maybe no. I think a lot of people live lives of quiet desperation, and they don't really realise how addicted they are, regardless of what it is, you know. So we always think, when we treat addiction, we think about it at absolute crisis stage, you know. And what I would like to see, I would see a natural evolution if we were open-minded, and if we actually had recovery experts in charge of this agenda, we would be treating addiction at a much earlier stage, like stage 1 cancer. You know, there's different progressive stages to addiction. We don't normally treat it till people are, you know, they've lost their job, their family, their house, their life, all that. There's much earlier stages in this progression.
But then I had, and I'll not go into too much detail because I could probably give away some details of somebody with an addiction problem that doesn't deserve to. If they want to talk about it, they can talk about it. But I had very, very close contact with somebody over a number of years, and I could see the problem. And I tried to get them help. And the first person I went to was a mother of a friend of mine who was an addiction counsellor. And she went, Craig, I'll do it because you've asked me, but it will not work. Because what you're asking me to do is make her realise that she's got a problem. And that'll not happen. If she's realised I'm going to split the possible people into 50%, I didn't even mean to say that. But now, if you're trying to get me to give her, she's not ready for it yet. Yeah. And she spoke to her and came back and she said, no, she's at that. So, and it's, you've got to hit rock bottom, really, sometimes.
No, well, people can skate along rock bottom for decades, and they can also die on rock bottom. So I don't believe you've got to hit rock bottom. I think if the more we talk about addiction, and the more people understand what it is and how it isolates us, and, you know, the quicker we'll be catching people before they hit so-called rock bottom. I think there's so many ways that we are as a society know well, or have really unwell behaviour, and I think addiction's just one of them, but it's a very dominant one.
What do you think the most important? Somebody's got to get a nudge, whether it's to get themselves or to get somebody to give them a nudge. What do you think the best chances of success are then? People that can see friends and family with issues try to push them to get help, or does it have to be the addict?
No, it doesn't have to be the addict. I mean, but what does have to happen is the addict has to feel the consequences. So if the family are cushioning those consequences for the addict and protecting those the addict, or doing their best as you do when you love somebody to cushion them and stop the worst of the consequences happening. I think if we knew, if families and loved ones knew a lot more about how to not enable addiction, then people would get weller a lot quicker, because in my case, there was consequences, right? But the denial around those consequences, the mental gymnastics that I did around, well, I've never ended up in hospital, I've never ended up in jail, I've never done these things. But then as my recovery progressed, I could look back and say, well, actually, I fell down the stairs at the Metro when I was 17, and I tore all my tendons. And there was various times where I had actually ended up in hospital, but my mind had tricked me into thinking it had nothing to do with alcohol or other drugs. And it was the same with, consequences around like the police and all that. Like, I was like, well, I've never been in a jail cell, but I had been arrested and huckled a couple of times, whilst in company. I'd never been charged with anything, but I had ended up in the cells, but my addiction denial, we did a meta-analysis on this a few years ago, and we showed that the main barrier to treatment was denial. So this is the only illness in the world that will tell you've not got it.
That's a cracking way of putting it.
I'm not even kidding. Like, I was years sober before I could think, actually, I did end up in the jail and I did end up in the cells. Do you know what I mean? But it was like my mind had tricked me into thinking.
Oh, listen, it's been wonderful talking to you, Annemarie. I can't thank you enough for giving me your time. I always say the greatest gift you can give anybody is your time, so thanks very much for that time you've given me today. Can you just finish on one thing? And the thing I didn't realise, I thought I was coming to speak to an activist who wanted this bill. I sort of had a bit, does this charity as well. What I didn't realise was why it was, you just a driver. And I think it's really refreshing that it's somebody with the lived experiences that's trying to drive this, rather than somebody trying to tell folk that have the lived experience what they should do. If anybody watching this has got any addiction problems, and you could rewind the clock back to that before the 25-year-old self of you, what advice would you give yourself, which could in turn be used with people who are maybe struggling just now?
I'd say reach out, ask people in recovery, how do you get well? I would just reach out to people in recovery. You can find us online, just type in, do hashtag recovery posse into any social media, and you'll find us. We're there, we're waiting for you, we'll help you. It's like any family you've ever known.
Great, well, that's fantastic. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed and learned through this podcast. I certainly have, recording it. If you have enjoyed it, just give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing if you haven't before. And I'll put some links in the description and the comments, so that if anybody does have either their own personal issues they need help with, or know people who could be helped and they need some guidance, we'll put some links to Annemarie's charity and as many other resources as we can. Okay, so unless you're anybody that steps in the way of this bill, everybody else in the world, have a great day. Cheery bye now.
Thank you. Cheers, Craig.